Hey, happy Wednesday morning, everyone, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. And boy, I appreciate you being with me. Now, I am filming this for Wednesday. I'm filming this on Saturday night. I was so depressed that my Razorbacks lost today that I thought, okay, I got to walk away. So I came to the office. I thought, well, I'm going to make myself useful, get rid of my depression, all that kind of stuff that goes along with being a sports fan. So disappointing. Uh, yeah, anyway, be that as it may. So yesterday, I told you about the idea. I floated an idea out there that I'm giving some thought to. I haven't committed to it yet, but I asked for your response. Now, since I'm filming this the same night that I filmed yesterday's video, I don't know your response. I'm going to assume that there is just overwhelming response to that and that everybody wants me to do it. I don't know. Okay, but on Friday, I will give a response to that. I'll kind of share with you the responses that I have gotten to that. And I'll consider those responses and I will see, number one, I'll see if I think I've actually got the time to do this. That's my biggest bugaboo right now. It really honestly is, because as I told you, I'm incredibly busy. And should I decide to do this, it will be mid-October, at least, because I'm up to here in my debate preparation, because as I'm sure you know, October the 12th, I will be debating Dr. Richard Carrier. He is an atheist. He actually claims that Jesus never existed, which is a rather weird belief, in my estimation, without any evidence. But nonetheless, that's not the topic of our discussion. The topic of our discussion is, did Jesus lie or fail in his predictions of his coming, the judgment, the resurrection, etc.? Dr. Richard Carrier says Jesus was a liar, or he failed, if he even existed. And so I affirm that Jesus did not lie, he did not fail. Now I want to tell you something. All of the futurists who watch this program, okay, you have no defense against Dr. Carrier. The full preterist view of eschatology is the only view of eschatology that can defend the claims of Christ, his apostles, the historicity and the reliability of Scripture against such men. Because guess what? Dr. Carrier knows. He knows what the Greek language says. He knows that the argument, oh, well, one day is with the Lord 1,000 years as a day, is a ridiculous argument. He knows that the argument, well, God doesn't see time like we do. He knows it's a ridiculous argument. He knows what Jesus predicted. He's got the wrong concept of the nature of what Jesus predicted. And this is the entire crux of our debate. Did Jesus lie? Did Jesus fail? Well, given the fact that he unequivocally said he was coming back in the first century generation in judgment with the angels to gather together the elect, since he undeniably said that, then if he was actually predicting his coming at the time of a cosmic conflagration and end of time, then he pretty clearly lied or failed. That's the challenge of Christ. And covenant eschatology, full preterism, let me say this again, is the only view of eschatology that can answer and defend the challenge of Christ. Now, I know I've got a lot of futurists to watch my tube. And you're going, how can you say that? I don't believe that. I don't know if Jesus actually predicted that. Well, yes, he did. It's not a question of if he said those things. It's a question of what did he mean by those words. This is a very important debate. Well, I got sidetracked just a little bit, but the point of fact is, should I decide to do this Wednesday evening blog, live blog, it will be after the middle of October. I will keep you posted on this. I'll keep you posted on the response to this idea and this suggestion, and I'll let you know if I decide to do it. And I know it's not normally kosher to say, I don't know if I'm going to do this or not. What do you think? But that's kind of where I'm at. All right? Keep it in mind. Now, I was sharing with you the fact, I've been sharing with you over the last couple of videos the meanings of the feast days, and specifically the meaning of Sukkot. The meaning that was attached to it by ancient rabbis and Jews for literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. It's what they taught that Yahweh meant when he established Sukkot. And it's what they looked forward to when Sukkot would be fulfilled. And the fulfillment of Sukkot, and of course I'm getting ahead of myself here, but Sukkot foreshadowed the final eschatological ingathering of God's people. Not to end evangelism, but to harvest the old covenant age, to bring that age to its end, to usher in the everlasting, unending kingdom of Christ that will never be moved or shaken. Hebrews chapter 12, 26 and following. Okay? So that would be the purpose of Sukkot, to harvest the old covenant age. Sukkot was called the Feast of Harvest, the Feast of Ingathering. And as I will be developing even more in depth with examination of Scripture after Scripture after Scripture, all of these New Testament prophecies that talk about the resurrection, that talk about the harvest at the end of the age, to a good faithful Jew, they would know that's what Sukkot pointed toward. Now, one of the things that I shared with you is that Sukkot was known as the joy of the nations. Because on Sukkot, and I know this is repetitious, but you really need to understand this. During the 7-day feast of Sukkot, 70 bulls were offered. They were offered on behalf of all of the nations, known and unknown. And by the way, reading from the good old King James, notice again, Zechariah chapter 14, 16 and following, that describes the time after the day of the Lord. Now, let me digress here for just a moment, okay? According to Isaiah chapter 66, you have the coming of the Lord in flaming fire to judge the nations. Isaiah 66, 15 and following. To reward the wicked. Got that? In verse 18 and following, survivors, let me say that word again, survivors of that day would be sent to the nations who had never known the Lord, who had never called on his name. And by the way, all you got to do is go back to Isaiah 63 and to find out who that is. They are the pagan, truly Goyim, truly Gentile, non-Israelite nations. They had never known the Lord. They had never called on his name. You know, that could never, ever, ever be said of the 10 northern tribes. It could never be said, well, the 10 northern tribes had never called on the name of the Lord. They had never known him. Of course, that could not be said of them. Period. End of story. But, once again, Isaiah 66, day of the Lord, judgment on Jerusalem, just like Zechariah 14. Zechariah 14 is, I am totally convinced, drawing on Isaiah 65 and Isaiah 66 about the day of the Lord and the coming new creation. In that new creation, survivors of the day of the Lord would go to the nations who had never known the Lord, who had never called on the name of the Lord, and call them to Zion to worship and to serve the Lord. This is not about the salvation of just Israel. And what do we find in Zechariah 14? After the day of the Lord, let me read this again from verse 16, King James Version. And it shall come to pass that everyone that is left of all the nations which came up against Jerusalem. Now, folks, this is talking about AD 70. And all the nations that came up against Jerusalem were not the 10 northern tribes. It is an absolute distortion and perversion of history. Now, once again, am I denying that some of the soldiers in the armies that came up there might have some Israelite DNA running, in their genes? I'm not denying that. After all, the 10 northern tribes were, quote, swallowed up by the nations, swallowed up among the nations, unquote. That was under the Assyrians. Then they were assimilated into the Babylonian diaspora, if you please, and captivity, because the Babylonians destroyed the Assyrians, and thus the 10 northern tribes were then in the Babylonian captivity. And then the Persians conquered the Babylonians, so now all 12 tribes are in the Persian captivity. They were intermarrying. So yeah, there's some Abrahamic DNA in all of these pagan nations. That doesn't mean those pagan nations were the 10 tribes. That is utterly ridiculous. I have challenged some of those Israel-only advocates to point me to a time and place in which the nations that had swallowed up Israel became no longer pagan nations, but became the 10 northern tribes. I haven't had anybody tell me that yet. Nobody's tried to answer the point at which the 10 tribes became the Gentiles and the time at which the Gentiles became the 10 northern tribes. Because you can't do that. Is it true that the 10 northern tribes were assimilated into and among the nations? Once again, I'm not denying that. They were intermarrying with the citizens of the nations under whom they served. That doesn't mean that the nations became them. That's a critical point. Okay, so once again, all of these nations that came up against Jerusalem, if they do not go up year by year to worship the Lord and to keep the Feast of Tabernacles, it shall be that whosoever will not come up of all the families of the earth out of Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, even upon them shall be no rain. Now watch this. And if the family of Egypt does not go up, well, folks, the Egyptians were not the Israelites. They shall have no rain. There shall be the plague wherewith the Lord will smite, watch this, will smite the heathen that come not up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, the day of the Lord, I want you to follow me very quickly, and I've got to hurry here in order to try to get this point across. The day of the Lord is the day of the resurrection. Everybody with me? The day of the Lord is the time of the resurrection. That's 1 Corinthians 15. The parousia is the time of the resurrection. which is the end of the Old Covenant law, the law that was the strength of sin. 1 Corinthians 15, 55, and 56. Once again, it's not the end of time. It's not the end of the Christian age. So the day of the Lord, the parousia, is the time of the resurrection. The resurrection is the time of the fulfillment of Sukkot. Sukkot represented, symbolized, foreshadowed. Are you following me now? Prophesied the resurrection. But those Old Covenant feast days were to last, including Sukkot, were only to last until what they foreshadowed became a reality. That's when they would cease. Kind of like what Jesus said in Matthew 5, 17 and 18. Do not think that I came to destroy the law of the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. And verily I say unto you, until heaven and earth passes away, not one jot or one tittle shall pass from the law until it is all fulfilled. Well, let me ask you a question. Is Leviticus chapter 23 part of the law? Well, anyone that would deny that doesn't know the Hebrew concepts. Of course it's the law. So the feast days were a fundamental, foundational part of the law. And as a matter of fact, the feast days were a huge part of the jots and the tittles. I mean, all you got to do is read Leviticus chapter 23 and Numbers chapter 28, and that's a whole bunch of jots and tittles. So the feast days comprised a massive part of the jots and the tittles of the law. And Jesus said, not one jot, not one tittle shall pass until it's all fulfilled. But guess what? When it was all fulfilled, it would indeed pass away. Why? Well, because the new covenant would be there. And the new covenant could do what the old could never do. The old could never give life, could never bring righteousness. Now, it was holy, it was good, it was, pure, spiritual, but it couldn't bring life and righteousness. And so Paul had to say, that which was intended to be life for me, I found to bring death. Romans chapter 7, 14 and following. Do you see what I'm saying here? The physical observance of the law, the physical observance of Sukkot, would end at the time of the resurrection. But wait a minute. The resurrection would occur at the day of the Lord. The establishment of the New Jerusalem, New Heaven and New Earth. Zechariah 14 was predicting the day of the Lord and the establishment of the New Jerusalem, and thus the New Heaven and New Earth. Just as Isaiah 66 foretold the day of the Lord against Jerusalem, resulting in bringing the pagans to Jerusalem to worship the Lord whom they had never known. And in Zechariah 14, at the day of the Lord, against Jerusalem, living waters flow out of the throne, i.e. in the temple, to bring life. That's Ezekiel 40 to 47, by the way. To bring life. That's resurrection life. So when the physical feast of Sukkot was fulfilled at the time of the resurrection, i.e. at the day of the Lord, in the judgment of Jerusalem, that which Sukkot foreshadowed, foretold, anticipated, would become a reality. And thus, the physical observance of Sukkot would end. And the spiritual observance, the spiritual celebration of life, resurrection life, could be and can be observed by all people of all nations, even those who had previously fought against the Lord, of all the nations under heaven. The nations would receive the salvation promised to Israel and that came through Israel, so that all men of any nation, of any tribe, kindred, tongue, and language could celebrate resurrection life. That life is in Jesus Christ, who said, I am the resurrection and the life. He's the fulfillment of Sukkot. He came, he destroyed the old covenant, he took away the physical observances, and we celebrate life in him. Okay, I'm completely out of time. Thank you so much for joining me for this morning's morning musings here on this wonderful Wednesday morning. And keep in mind, let me know what you think about my idea about a live blog on Wednesdays. And in the meantime, I hope to see you on Friday morning as we continue our review and response to Brian Hodges' book, Problems with Preterism, as we continue our discussion about Mr. Hodges' reliance on a presuppositional position, and that is, well, when you read Daniel and Daniel's influence on eschatology, you have to understand Daniel wasn't talking about the time of the end. He's talking about the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. We'll talk about that on Friday. I'll see you there.